Was about 9 years old, and we were on a school trip where the class would go out to what we would call a conservation area. So like a forested area, and they would sometimes have us collecting leaves, or they would give us compasses and maps, and we would, find our way around, because this was back in, sort of the late 70s. And I was with a small group of my friends, and we weren't supervised back then either. There weren't any adults with us, but we were just going on our way. Somehow I ended up too close to an edge, and I went over the edge. It's hard as a child to determine how high the drop was. I don't think it was high enough that I would have immediately died from the fall height itself. But as I started to fall, my body was frozen in midair. And when that happened, I was no longer aware of my body. And it was like I entered into a void. I didn't see any lights. I didn't see a tunnel. I didn't see any beings. It was this very unusual sense of nothingness, complete nothingness. And I received a thought that said that if I continued to fall the way I was, that I was going to strike my head on a rock at the bottom and I would die. And I was told that that was perfectly fine if I wanted to choose that, but I could also choose instead to continue on with the life I was. There was no information given to me about what would happen in that life or giving me any indication of my choice. But I was shown a review of my life up until that time. So from birth to age 9. And that was the part that stuck with me the most, was because it happened literally in an instant. I saw 9 years of life, just like that. And I made the decision that I would continue on in the life I had. And once I made that decision, my body was turned in midair to a different position. And then I was back in my body. Time started again, and the fall happened. And instead of landing with my head on the rock, I landed with my knee on the rock and was sort of limping out with the help of my classmates. I remember having to go to the hospital and have x-rays and being on crutches, but it wasn't a severe injury by any means. And so for the first few days afterwards, I was telling people what had happened and describing, this very unusual event. And nobody would have any response to me. It wasn't that I was told, don't talk about that, or that's, you're making stuff up or anything. There was literally just no response at all to when I would talk about it. And so after a couple of days, I decided I would just stop talking about it. And I really didn't think much about it afterwards, other than I was left with sort of this background thought that the world was not exactly the way I had thought it had been up until then. Definitely when time stopped. That was the most striking part of the experience for me, was that time could stop, and the nothingness that I experienced when I was in that space where time had stopped. And it's impossible to describe it, but this idea of being sort of nothing and everything at the same time. And again, as a child, it was even more difficult to wrap your head around. But that was the part that was the strangest thing, was that time could be stopped and restarted again. No, and that's why this experience was different than a lot of the near-death experiences that I hear about. And I've certainly, as I grew into an adult, as I became a nurse, as I was in healthcare, I was always drawn to stories of near-death experiences because of that. But mine was different from what I would often hear people describe from their experience, because there was no emotion whatsoever. I've been asked before, did you have any concerns about, leaving your family? And sometimes I was asked, did you have any concerns about your classmates that were there, perhaps about to witness your death? And there was no emotion whatsoever. I would have liked to have experienced what I've heard some people describe in their experience, where, this feeling of bliss and love and that. Mine was different in the sense that it was almost like a very in-between state. I feel like perhaps if I had chosen to not continue in my life at that time, that I would have progressed into what we here talked about as a more, typical near-death experience. But what I experienced at the time was complete neutrality. I felt the pain after I fell, yes, but when I returned to my body and for the brief moment where the fall was continuing, I had a complete sense of peace, that there was this sense of, everything is fine. There's nothing to worry about, nothing to be concerned about. First thing I remember being left and thinking a lot about that life review. That was and even at the age of 9, thinking, how is it possible that I saw 9 years of time in a split second? That was always the part that stayed with me as most unusual aspect of it. You would think that, the time stopping part might be the most interesting part as a child, but it was that life review, and I could never understand how I saw all of that experience in one instant. Well, there wasn't much because it was only 9 years, and there was nothing about it that sort of stood out to me, which was also, again, it was being in this state of sort of neutrality, and that there was no reaction to it. Everything was fine. Like, it wasn't sort of seeing something that was traumatic versus something that was, wonderful and full of love, and sort of having those different emotions. It was simply just watching it happen, almost like it was from the aspect of that it wasn't me in a sense, but I knew it was me. But there was this sort of a little bit of a separation, I guess. And once I returned to my body, then that separation was over. And I felt as much of myself as I had, the moment before. I felt about the very subject of near-death experiences. That was really as I got a little bit older. So when this happened, there was no such thing, I don't think, as near-death experiences. I mean, I guess I was young enough that it's possible they had been sort of started to be researched, but I wasn't old enough to know that. But it wasn't until, sort of I graduated high school and went into nursing school that they were even mentioned, that the term was mentioned. And back then, it was considered to be something, that people talked about and most people didn't believe. It was a little easier when you were in the medical field, because you would sometimes witness people that had been resuscitated and said that they saw something. I have asked people sometimes in my career, but there's never been anybody that has shared it with me as their nurse. Again, whether that was something they didn't feel comfortable, or I'm not sure, but no. So I sort of came to know about near-death experiences as I was becoming an adult, and I was always drawn to them. And if there was something on television about it, I would always watch it. I didn't really read any books until I was probably in my late adulthood, almost in my 40s. It's strange. I didn't talk about it much as I got older. It would sometimes sort of come up in conversation if near-death experiences came into the conversation, and I would mention I had one. And it's it's interesting how many times, if you bring it up, that other people will talk about either something that happened to them or a family member it's happened to, but you almost have to bring it up first so that people feel safe to talk about it, because there's always that worry about, is somebody going to think that, there's something wrong with me, or are they going to judge me? As I got older and sort of headed into my sort of late 40s and early 50s was when I had sort of, more of a spiritual awakening. And I was not spiritual in my life leading up to that time, despite having this experience as a child. I was very science-based. I was an ICU nurse. I was not spiritual. And that sort of came out of the blue as I got older. And when it happened, that was when I realized that being able to anchor back into that experience was so helpful for me. It was almost like that experience I had was not for my benefit when I was a child. It was for when I got older, and then I could use it for my benefit, which I think is why it didn't play a large role in my thoughts and my life until I got older. My life before the near-death experience was pretty typical. A child in the 70s, you had lots of independence, and you kind of were, as I mentioned, unsupervised a lot. Your parents sort of let you out, and you went and played outside a lot, and you just had to be home at a certain time. I had a very typical childhood with, a family and brother and sister. I liked school. I liked going to school. I enjoyed learning. Yeah, I was a pretty typical happy kid, and I remained that way after the experience. Again, I don't feel like it changed me as a child. I feel what was left behind from that as I grew older was that I seemed to keep a bit of that neutrality with me, in that I went through, and it's hard to know what my personality was like when I was that much younger. It's hard to remember yourself when you're that young. But I do know that when I became a teenager and an adult, I was always very calm, very easygoing. I had a positive outlook on life. I always assumed that everything was going to work out for me and for my life. It pretty much has. And I didn't get attached to a lot. I didn't criticize myself that I think a lot of people do. I had a good sense of myself, and I felt positive about myself. And it wasn't until I got a bit older and looked back and realized that that wasn't typical for people, especially growing up, in the 80s and 90s like I did. I get a sense that I may have been impacted by that experience, and having that experience of sort of neutrality and kind of being everything and nothing at the same time may have stayed with me a little bit as I got older and shaped my personality a little bit that way. I didn't change so much again when I was younger. My change came when I got older. And so and it was triggered when I left nursing to go into music, which I got a chance to do in my late 40s. And that is what seemed to trigger this sort of spiritual awakening that I was not ready for and that I was not interested in having. But I, experienced this event where I had a tap sensation at the base of my skull and a voice in my head. And that seemed to sort of open up a floodgate of what people refer to as downloads, which I didn't even know at the time what was happening to me. And I sort of went through this abrupt introduction to spiritualism. And that was when I could refer back to this near-death experience and go, it's okay. You've had something very strange happen to you before. You know that things are sometimes different than they appear, and that's okay. And so that was when that experience sort of held me and kept me sort of centered and grounded through this experience. And then I ended up eventually going to Sedona and in a vortex. And there I had another very unusual experience and ended up sort of embodying my higher consciousness and went through years of integration with that. And I don't think I could have come out of those years and that experience as well as I have without having that experience as a child. So again, I feel like it happened when it happened for whatever reason at that time, but it was designed to benefit me later in life. The music turned out to be just the pathway, I think. So it was one of those things where I crossed paths with a producer and he said, would you like to record? And I was at a position in my life where I could stop working for a while and pursue this full time. And I was doing it just to do it. I just wanted the experience of it and to have the music afterwards. I wasn't planning on, I'd share it with my family and friends, but I just wanted the experience. And all of a sudden, having never, I didn't play an instrument, I didn't write songs, but all of a sudden I was receiving songs, like being channeled, as they say. And this was the part that was, throwing me off. And this is what sort of prompted this night, where the tap in the head and the voice in the head. And all of a sudden I was writing songs. And when the music part was over, like it got to the point where, we were going to Nashville to mix the songs at Warner Brothers Studios. And it was this very exciting, experience, and decided to put some of the songs onto an EP and release them. And we released a single in October of 2019. It got, airplay on country radio in Canada. And it was sort of like, okay, am I going to, do something really with this music stuff? And instead, COVID happened. And so I felt like it was appropriate for me to go back to intensive care and help because there was such a need. And at that point, music was not a thing anymore. The world had sort of shut down. And so once I went back into healthcare, that was sort of what it almost sort of put an end to the music chapter and took me now into where I certainly still do traditional medicine in hospital, ICU, but I also now do, sort of energy medicine and energy therapy. And it was sort of like a full circle moment with the music, that it was sort of like an entryway. It took me out of my, sort of that mindset of science and, my logical brain, and kind of released me into a creative time that sort of opened up this other pathway in my life that had kind of just been, I think, sitting there waiting. And then once it had served its purpose, which was to open me up for that, then I circled back into nursing and back into this pathway of just being of service to others. What I do is a little different in the sense that when I was in the vortex in Sedona 19, I sort of went unconscious for a period of time, and we were with a guide on a private tour, and he kind of went to sleep too. We all sort of went to sleep. And when I got back to my hotel room in the afternoon, I slept from like 2 p.m. till the next day, other than I woke up around 9 o'clock and had something to eat and then went right back to sleep. And I didn't understand what had happened. I didn't know what had happened. And it wasn't until I had a private session with a channeler at the end of 2020, Paul Selig, who is a pretty well-known clairaudient channeler. And I said, can your guides tell me what happened in that Sedona vortex. And he said what had happened was that my higher consciousness was integrated physically into my body at that time, but that it takes a long time to integrate it because your body can't sort of accept it right away. So there was a period of time over a number of years where I would have these, sometimes I would get hives, sometimes I would get, vibrations in my body, in one certain area of my body for a week, and then it would go away. And then I'd have a couple of weeks where I felt fine, and then something else would happen. And so that was the integration physically of this higher consciousness. Once it was sort of fully done, back around sort of the end of 2023, beginning of 2024, now what I'm able to do for people is I can give them access to their higher consciousness, almost like I'm a portal, like an embodied portal. And so when I do sessions with people, and I do them over Zoom with people all over the world, and I go into a theta state and they go into a theta state. So we have to make sure that we're both somewhere comfortable. And for about 30 or 40 minutes, they can achieve what normally would require, a pretty dedicated meditation practice over a number of months or a year, or it would require breath work or plant medicine, but they're able to access that almost through me and sort of be able to access their hierarchy. And it's whatever gives them the benefit that they require at that time. So it's a little different. I became a Reiki practitioner initially, and so I have practiced traditional Reiki. This is something a little different. That's a great question. I saw life differently after the near-death experience as a child, in that I approached life from a really positive stance, that I was going to be fine no matter what happened in my life. And whether that was, again, left from my experience, it probably was. I didn't realize it at the time. But when I look back at how I approached life in my 20s and 30s, it was always with a very everything's going to be fine attitude. And for the most part, I really never had disappointments. I had very few in my life. And when I did, it was always, okay, well, something else is going to come along to take care of that. Now, given the last 10 years or so, with this new type of helping people that I do now I realize that we have so much more control over our life, and that we shape our reality more than we realize. And I think that people are starting to become more aware of that as time is happening, and that people now talk about manifestation and energy and chakras and things that even 6, 7, 8 years ago, when you said, have you heard of Reiki? And people would say, what's that? When I sought out Reiki for my own sort of physical symptoms as I was integrating that higher consciousness, I didn't know what Reiki was. I knew it had something to do with energy. That I had heard that much. And so that's how I sought it out, to have somebody do Reiki for me. And now I find people know a lot more about Reiki, and it's accepted. In my own hospital, in my intensive care unit, I do little 5-10 minute sessions, putting my hands on the shoulders of my colleagues, and they are able to sort of calm their nervous system down. And I mean, we're talking about an intensive care unit where things are highly stressful, and it gives them that chance to sort of leave that fight or flight part of their nervous system that is quite activated, and give them calm and relaxation. And some of them don't know what it is. They just go, oh, well, that's just Lori's hands, and come put them on me. And others are like, oh, I need some voltage. Give me some of that good voltage. And these are, ICU nurses, very science-based. They haven't gone through experiences that I have, but they know what they feel and they know what they experience. And they are accepting of the idea that we can have all kinds of therapies available to people. And people are going to align to whatever feels right for them. And I don't look at the work I do in the hospital as less than the work that I do with people from a consciousness standpoint. Because the people that are in the hospital in the bed want me to treat them with traditional medicine, because in their mind, that is what they require. People that seek me out for higher consciousness sessions have reached a stage where they feel that that is something that is going to benefit them. And so I'm very grateful that I'm in a position where I can still do both. From the experience I had as a child, I wish that people could realize that our natural state is one of neutrality. And there's a lot of power in that every experience we have is neutral at its core. And then we label it based on our beliefs, our experiences, and that you have the power to label it what you prefer. And in time, if you can think about that and work on it, you'll realize that that is an immense power you have to shape your experiences by viewing them from neutrality at first, and then saying, okay, how can I define that experience so that it is going to make me feel positive and good? As opposed to automatically, we unfortunately tend to look at things from a negative standpoint much more easily. And that's simply habit. And also, what is around us. It's sort of taught to us as we grow up. And one of the things I think this near-death experience gave me as a child was almost like a coat of armor, where I did not absorb those negative things. And so I was able to maintain either a neutrality or a positive approach to whatever experiences I had. Right now, where I'm at now, it's the other benefit I think it shows me now is when I am in consciousness sessions with people and in a theta state, it's not as extreme, but it's going back a little bit to that sort of state of being both nothing and everything at the same time, and getting into a state where you're in an in-between. And so I think it is helpful to me to do the work I'm doing now by having had that very strong experience as a child, to have gone outside the body, and the experience of the stoppage of time. I don't think I realized until almost just the past couple of years that was really impactful, the experience of that. And it gives me a little bit, it's still difficult when you're in the body, sort of having your human experience, but it helps me still relate a tiny bit easier to the idea of infinity and eternity and sort of the allness. Because when we're in our bodies, there's a lot of limitations, there's a lot of density being in the body. And when people talk about near-death experiences and leaving the body, they have that experience of that everything, even like the movie, everything everywhere all at once. Having had a brief experience of that, even all those years ago, gives me a tiny bit more of understanding that, even though I'm still in the limitations of my body, that I can sort of every now and then go, yeah, but you know that everything is all at once sort of idea. I don't expect people to not fear death if they have never had an experience like this. I think that's a lot to ask people. But personally, I don't fear death, of course. That I do share sometimes with families and patients that are going through death that I believe, and I often don't talk about my own personal experience with patients and families in that aspect. I talk about all the deaths I have seen in my career as a nurse, and that I believe that we choose the time of our death, that we have much more control over our death from our body than we think we do from being in our living state. Because I've seen so many patients sort of die on a particular day, or, they'll stay alive for such a long period of time, more than we expect. And then when the family leaves to go get a cup of coffee, that's when they die. Because for whatever reason, that patient didn't want people watching them when they took their last breath. So I try to share that with patients and family members when they're going through that. But I've come to believe right now, and maybe this will change as time goes on and I have more experiences, but I feel like it's all about our frequency. And that, when we're in our bodies, we're compressing our frequency, that our natural state is more of an energetic state, a spiritual state, however you want to label it. But we sort of compress that frequency down in order to have this density of experience in our bodies. And so I feel like death is just us releasing that compression of that frequency and allowing our frequencies to climb back up to more of our natural state, and that we can't hold a body in that state, in that frequency. It's too high. And that we simply then move to a different experience at the frequency that we're at then. To me, it feels like an excitement. I don't fear the pain of death. I don't feel like we suffer, because we've had a lot of near-death experiencers tell us that at the time of their death, if it's something traumatic, a car accident or a drowning or anything like that, they often talk about that they're sort of out of their body before they have an experience like that. So I believe that, and I think that that is true, and that there isn't suffering at the end for our deaths. And I think a lot of people in healthcare who have seen patients sort of just before they die, technically, and after they die, that you can just see that there's something has left, and it is a spark, it is an energy. It's hard to describe it, but I can see a patient who, has very little heartbeat, almost no blood pressure. They're so sort of close to being clinically dead, but their heart is technically still beating. They're technically still breathing, but it's almost not there. And they look a certain way. And then 2 minutes can pass where we finally then have a stoppage of the heart and lungs. And you can then look at that body and it looks so different. And it's hard to give a specific, but I think most nurses and doctors that have seen somebody go from living to dead clinically in that time period, that you can just tell that there is something that is beyond just a physical heartbeat and respirations, that is no longer in that body. And so that's the energy that I'm talking about. And that it just isn't contained in there anymore. But It doesn't go anywhere. It's still there. It doesn't leave us. It's just in a different state. And it's a state that doesn't match anymore with the state that we're in when we're in our bodies. And so we lose that ability to see it, to hear it as we're used to. It's a very different aspect of whether somebody is dying themselves or whether somebody is losing a loved one. So when somebody is going to be dying themselves, that I have the thought of, you know, you're about to have an incredible adventure. And, I think what awaits you is difficult to even imagine, that it's going to be so vast and so have so much possibilities. That's what I feel like when we leave the body, we enter into a frequency of unlimited possibilities. It's very different though when you're losing somebody you love. Even though I feel the way I do about what death is, it does not mean that grief is not real. Loss is real. And for those that are left behind, per se, that loss is totally real. It doesn't matter that the loved one is still around. You tell them that, they haven't gone anywhere. Yes, but I can't access them right now, and I miss them and I love them, and that grief is real. And so I often tell family members, what you are feeling is authentic, and it's part of what we all experience in this life that we've chosen. That if you experience that much love and attachment to somebody, then if they pass first, then you will experience grief. I look at it as it's almost a privilege. It's hard to view it that way if you go through it. And I've lost, loved ones in my life. I've experienced that. But you wouldn't experience that grief if you didn't have that love to start with. So in a way, it does feel like it's a price to pay, absolutely, and it hurts and it's painful, but it means that you had that deep of a love to start with that resulted in you missing somebody so much after they're not with you anymore.